Well, hello, I'm Mike, and welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Study. So go ahead, grab a Bible. We're going to open it up to Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. Today we'll be looking at the story of Jairus' daughter and the bleeding woman. Let's dive in. Now first, as always, let's set the context. As we saw in our last episode, Jesus had gotten into a boat, sailed across the Sea of Galilee, where he'd gotten out on the shores in the country of the Gerasenes. And in that place, he had an encounter with a man who was possessed by a legion of demons. And Jesus healed this man, body, mind, spirit, restored him into his right mind, and then sent the man out to tell the countryside and the villages around there what Jesus had done for him. Then Jesus gets back on the boat and sails away. Now, Jesus is back over at Capernaum, back in Jewish country, and this is what happens, starting at verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And Jesus went with him. All right, so there's a crowd waiting for him. The same crowd that Jesus had tried to escape in the end of chapter 4 is right there waiting for him now. They want him to pick up where he left off. And so Jesus arrives at shore and he gets out of the boat. There's the crowds waiting, and a synagogue ruler comes to Jesus. His name is Jairus. Now, Jairus is somebody important. He is a ruler of the synagogue, and up until this point, at least for the last couple chapters, generally the powers that be have not been happy with Jesus. They felt threatened by him. Jairus, on the other hand, is desperate, and we see it right here in the text. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly. Now, we've seen in Mark a couple different things. We've seen that for Mark, proximity is important. How close you are to Jesus, actually, it tells us something about the character's relationship with Jesus. And Jairus runs right up to Jesus and falls at his feet. Posture is also important in the Gospel of Mark. It tells us something about the character. And so Jairus runs up, proximity, falls at his feet, posture. He's demonstrating his humility before Jesus, making it clear that he's desperate for Jesus, that he needs Jesus. And then he begs him, implored him earnestly. This man has a serious problem. He's got a daughter. His daughter is dying. He knows his only hope is Jesus. And so he runs to him in front of the entire crowd. He humbles himself, begs Jesus to go with him. And of course, Jesus responds. When we come to Jesus, when we draw close to Jesus, when our posture before Jesus is one of earnestness and humility, we humble ourselves before him, he always responds. But as we'll see, Jesus doesn't always respond in the way that we expect or the way that we hope. Let's continue with the story. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." All right, so we still have the situation with the crowd. The crowd is thronging about Jesus. They're going with Jesus as Jesus goes with Jairus, and there's this woman who approaches him in the midst of the crowd. She'd had a discharge of blood for 12 years. 12 years is a really long time. Now, we don't know if it's a literal 12 years or if Mark is using 12 here figuratively. Often in the Bible, 12 is a symbolic number. It's a number of completeness. Either way, she has been really unwell and uncomfortable for a really long time. Now, in the past, when I've taught this passage to high schoolers or to college students, there's something that I like to do to help especially the young men enter into this text a little bit, but the women as well. And so what I've done in the past is I've asked the men to leave the room. And I've asked the girls to have a discussion among themselves about what it might be like to have a discharge of blood for 12 years. We don't often actually think about what the woman is dealing with. We just know she was sick. It was uncomfortable. And what we do is I ask the women, the girls, to talk amongst themselves about what that might have been like. and then to try to explain to the guys what it might have been like. Now, I'm not going to do that in this video because I'm a male and that would just be awkward, but I think it is worth pressing the pause button and think about the discomfort, the humiliation that might have come with a discharge of blood that you couldn't control and that didn't stop for 12 years. Okay, there's the physical side of it. Then there's a spiritual side for this woman. If she was bleeding, Old Testament law, that would have made her unclean. And so here's a woman who had been unclean for 12 years. Now, if you're unclean, you're unable to participate in temple worship. So she would have been excluded from the religious life of her people. Now, if you touch someone who's unclean, it makes you unclean. So this woman likely had not participated in spiritual, religious, and for ancient Jews, that would have been social life of her people for 12 years. She also would not have experienced much by way of human touch for 12 years. That's why touch here matters so much. Now, the text tells us that she'd suffered much under the hand of many physicians. She had gone to a lot of doctors, and none of them had helped. They had only made it worse, more suffering, poking and prodding, and best guesses from men who had no idea. She'd spent all she had. She was now destitute. All of her money, her income, her resources had been spent trying to get well, nothing. So this woman is broke. She's alienated from people. She's alienated from the life of her people. She's experienced no human touch, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. So we've got this juxtaposition going on. We've got Jairus, who's a person of great importance and influence, but who's desperate. He does all the right things. He comes and he falls at Jesus' feet and begs him to heal his daughter. And then we've got Jairus juxtaposed with the bleeding woman. Jairus is named. The bleeding woman is never named. We don't know her name. She's a nobody, okay? She's broke. She's ostracized, excluded, outcast. But like Jairus, she is in desperate need of a healing touch from Jesus. And she's heard about him. And so she slips through the crowd, thinking to herself, if I can just get close enough to touch him, I will be made well. Now that in and of itself is a bold move, because if she touches Jesus, then she risks making this healer unclean. But she's desperate enough that she is willing to do it. The text tells us, and immediately when she touched him, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, the touch from Jesus, or rather her touch of Jesus, has healed her of her physical ailments. Proximity to Jesus, for her, in this instance, brings healing. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And Jesus looked around to see who had done it. So Jesus, he knows something has happened. Now, of course, he's in a crowd. They are thronging about him. That's the word that Mark had used earlier. Of course, people are touching him. He's being jostled, touched all the time, and yet he knew that this touch was different. He had felt the power go out of him, and he felt it immediately. There's that word again that we see again and again in Mark. Immediately, Jesus knew, and he stops, and he looks around. His disciples are like, "Jesus, you're being a little bit ridiculous here. Of course somebody touched you." But Jesus, he knows that something different is up. And so he looked around to see who had done it. And the woman, knowing what had happened to her, she knew that she had been made well, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. The woman's afraid. She has only for 12 years experienced suffering, embarrassment, humiliation, pain, and loss at the hands of men. And I can't help but wonder if a little part of her wonders if maybe Jesus is going to be like those other men. So she comes before him, fear and trembling. She is afraid. And the text tells us she fell down before him. We've seen this before. Back in verse 22, Jairus comes to Jesus and falls at his feet. The woman has already gotten close to Jesus, proximity. And now her posture changes to one of desperation and humility. But look what she does here. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. This is perhaps the crux of this whole text. Let's not miss this. The woman comes to Jesus, falls down at his feet, and tells him the whole truth. She tells him her whole story, right there in the middle of the crowd, and a crowd that was going places because the very important synagogue ruler's daughter is dying. And yet Jesus stops and listens to her story. He hears her story, her 12-year-long story. She told him the whole truth. He calls her daughter, and he tells her in that moment that it's her faith that has made her well. And so go in peace. This woman who had experienced only suffering is now sent and given peace. Thanks so much for joining me in this week's episode of the 10-Minute Bible Study. If this was helpful for you, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, and I'll see you soon.